Every war America has ever fought has a name, a story, a reason. Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. You know these wars. You understand roughly why they happened. But there is one war, the war that came before all of them, that most people couldn't explain if you put a gun to their head. They know the dates. They've heard the phrase. They might picture muddy trenches and old black and white photographs of men in helmets. But here's what nobody ever quite tells you. That war didn't just happen. It didn't erupt the way wars are supposed to erupt, out of hatred, out of clear aggression, out of some obvious, undeniable evil. It crawled forward. It stumbled. It was built by accident and arrogance, and the terrifying momentum of systems that nobody understood and nobody could stop. And once it started, once the gears locked and the machinery began to turn, it consumed an entire civilization, not metaphorically, literally. The world that existed before the summer of 1914 was gone forever by the time the guns finally went quiet 4 years later. The kings, the empires, the borders, the certainties, all of it dissolved. And in the dirt of one thin strip of Western Europe, on a front line that stretched from the cold gray waters of the English Channel down to the mountains of Switzerland, the most catastrophic thing in human history up to that point played itself out in the mud and blood of a place called the Western Front. This is that story, not the textbook version, not the list of dates and treaties and generals with unpronounceable names, the real version. The version of what it actually felt like to be there, in the trench, in the gas, in the dark. The version of what it means that the machine nobody could stop was built by human beings, educated, sophisticated, proud human beings who genuinely, sincerely believed they were doing the right thing. And the version of why this story, more than a century later, still has something to say to you, watching this right now, in the world those men accidentally built. If this kind of story pulls you in, hit subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is where you are. Every time I see someone watching from Tokyo at 3 in the morning, or from Texas on a Tuesday afternoon, it reminds me why stories like this matter. They connect us across everything. Now, let's go back to the summer that changed the world. Europe in 1914 is not a place of fear. It is a place of electricity, literally and figuratively. Gas lamps are giving way to electric light. Automobiles are rattling down cobblestone streets that once belonged to horses. Women in elaborate hats are stepping into department stores that feel like palaces. Telephones are appearing in offices and wealthy homes. The newspapers are full of the marvels of modern science. Aircraft, radio waves, internal combustion engines, the X-ray. If you are a middle-class person in London, or Paris, or Vienna, or Berlin in the summer of 1914, your life is measurably, demonstrably better than the life of your grandparents in almost every way that can be counted. And the deep, unspoken assumption underneath all of it, the assumption so basic nobody even bothered to say it out loud, is that this is the direction history travels. Forward, better, brighter. For over a decade before that summer, imperialist governments, a fierce arms race, rising nationalism, and the obligations of a complex web of international alliances had created an atmosphere in which war was very much in the air. The tension was structural. It was buried in the architecture of the continent itself. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy had formed in the 1880s, and it faced off against the Triple Entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia. Two armed camps staring at each other across a continent, each one convinced that the other was the threat, each one building more weapons, training more soldiers, drawing up more war plans to protect against the other's war plans. Historians would later describe the leaders of this period as sleepwalkers, men moving with total confidence toward a cliff they couldn't see. Each great power was pursuing its own interests without real respect for the interests of the others, and each was willing, for the sake of those interests, to take the risk of a major conflict. And then, on a warm Sunday morning in late June, in a narrow street in a Balkan city that most people in London and Paris couldn't have found on a map, the fuse was lit. Sarajevo, June 28th, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie, were shot at close range while being driven through the city. The man who fired the shots was 19 years old. His name was Gavrilo Princip, and what followed from that moment, those two small detonations in a narrow street on a Sunday morning, was so far beyond anything any of the participants intended, so catastrophically out of proportion to its cause, that even now it seems almost impossible to believe. History might have played out very differently had a driver not made a wrong turn. The royal motorcade had survived a bomb attack earlier that morning. Franz Ferdinand had insisted on visiting the wounded at a hospital. Nobody told the driver about the route change. He turned down the wrong street, realized his mistake, slowed the car to a crawl to reverse, and brought the Archduke to a complete stop, directly in front of the one man in the city who most wanted him dead. Princip was standing outside a delicatessen. He had given up. He thought the assassination had failed. And then history turned the corner and stopped right in front of him. 2 shots, 37 days, and the world was at war. The international crisis that began in Sarajevo and culminated in the British declaration of war on Germany on the 4th of August is known as the July Crisis. In those 5 weeks, every major power on the continent, bound by alliance obligations, driven by pride, pushed by military timetables that had taken years to construct and couldn't simply be paused, tumbled over the edge one after another, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th, exactly a month after Ferdinand's death. By the following week, Germany, Russia, France, Belgium, and Great Britain had all been drawn in. Crowds cheered in the streets of European capitals. Young men rushed to enlist before the adventure was over. Generals in freshly pressed uniforms predicted the whole thing would be done by Christmas, or so the recruiting posters and official communiques suggested, though some of the men going in had their private doubts. Mothers watched their sons march away with tears of pride and fear mixed together in a way that no word adequately describes. And here is the question that should stop you cold before we go any further. What do you do when you are an ordinary person, a farmer, a factory worker, a teacher, a young man who has never been more than 20 miles from the village where he was born, and the most powerful machine in the world suddenly points at you and says, "Your turn?" Because that is what happened next. He was 18 years old. His name doesn't appear in any history book. Let's call him Thomas, because there were tens of thousands of Thomases. British boys from small towns, from mill towns, from farms in Yorkshire and Wales, and the flatlands of East Anglia. Thomas had never seen a trench before. He had never heard artillery. He had no particular reason to hate Germans. He had enlisted because his mates did, because the posters said it was the right thing to do, because the war was going to be a great adventure, and his country needed him. His boots were new, and they rubbed blisters on his heels as he marched. He was thinking about that, actually, the blisters, when the sound reached him for the first time. A sound like the sky itself tearing open. A sound you don't just hear with your ears, but feel in your chest, in the hollow behind your sternum, in the roots of your teeth. He had no reference point for what that sound was. Nobody did, the first time. Earlier years of the First World War could be characterized as a clash of 20th-century technology with 19th-century military thinking, creating ineffective battles with enormous numbers of casualties on both sides. That sentence, dry as it is, contains one of the darkest truths of the whole war. The generals who commanded these armies had been trained in the traditions of previous centuries. They believed in the power of the charge, the shock of massed infantry, the decisive breakthrough. They had studied Napoleon. They had read about Waterloo. They thought in terms of cavalry and momentum, and the morale of men moving forward with fixed bayonets. What they ran into was something entirely different. Machine guns were perhaps the most important weapons of World War I. They could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, and they had a devastating effect on enemy forces. Consider what that means in practice. A line of men walking across an open field, and they were made to walk, the officers insisted on it, thought that running would break formation, walking toward a position defended by one of these weapons. The machine gun doesn't care about your courage. It doesn't care that you volunteered, that you have a photograph of your mother in your breast pocket, that you are 19 years old and have never kissed a girl. It simply fires, at a rate that no human mind was built to comprehend until it was actually happening. When used in combination with trenches and barbed wire emplacements, these weapons gave a decided advantage to the defense, since their rapid and sustained firepower could decimate a frontal assault by either infantry or cavalry. And nobody in charge, seemed to fully absorb this fact before the dying began. By the end of 1914, after 5 months of fighting, the number of dead and wounded across all fronts had reached somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million men. 2.5 million in 5 months. And the war was supposed to be over before the snow came. Instead, what happened was a race. Not a race to victory, a race to the sea. As the front stabilized, the armies carried out a series of flanking maneuvers, each side attempting to outpace the other to the north. Failure to break through created a stalemate, forming a contiguous front line stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Both sides dug in. Literally, they picked up shovels and they dug. Because the ground was the only thing that could protect you from the machine guns, from the artillery shells, from the shrapnel that hummed through the air at speeds your eye couldn't track. By winter of 1914, this vast network had become the infernal, sinister, and often muddy setting of the Western Front. The trench systems on the Western Front stretched roughly 400 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. 400 miles of dug earth, driving from New York City to Pittsburgh and back. And for every single mile of that drive, a trench full of men, and on the other side of no man's land, another trench full of men. And between them, wire and mud and death. And those men aren't going anywhere. They've been there for months. Some of them will be there for years. Military technology of the time included critical innovations in machine guns, grenades, and artillery, along with weapons essentially new to warfare: submarines, poison gas, warplanes, and tanks. Every one of those things existed before 1914 in some form, but they had never been combined. They had never been produced in the quantities that industrial capitalism could produce them. They had never been deployed against each other by armies numbering in the millions, on a front that stretched for hundreds of miles, with the full weight of national economies behind them. The war resulted in an estimated 15 to 22 million military and civilian casualties. But even that number, staggering as it is, doesn't quite capture the scale of what happened. Around 230 soldiers died for every hour the war continued. A combatant was killed every 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds. The time it takes you to read a sentence, the time it takes you to take 3 slow breaths. Someone's son, someone's brother, snuffed out. And that is only the dead. That doesn't count the men who came back broken. Now, here is a question you need to sit with, because it is the question that nobody in charge could answer. How do you fight a war where defense is so overwhelmingly more powerful than offense? How do you break through a line of trenches defended by machine guns, artillery, and a wall of barbed wire that stretches as far as the eye can see? The generals tried everything. Artillery bombardments that lasted for days, intended to destroy the wire and silence the guns before the infantry went over the top. Flanking maneuvers, tunneling, new weapons. Nothing worked. Nothing broke the line. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas became 1 year, 2 years, 3. Men rotated in and out of the trenches like workers on a shift that never ended, except the shift might kill you. The ground doesn't just shake. That's not the right word for it. Shaking is what happens when a truck rolls past your house, when a subway car rattles the windows. What happens under artillery bombardment is something different, something older. The ground moves the way water moves when you drop a stone into it, in waves, one after another, without pause, without end. Except the stone weighs 1,000 pounds and falls every 3 seconds, and the waves pass through the soles of your boots, and up through your ankles, and into your spine, and into the back of your skull. And after a while you stop feeling it as an external thing, and start feeling it as something happening inside you. Your own body vibrating, your own teeth rattling, your own heart struggling to find its rhythm against the constant, relentless percussion of a world that has decided to come apart.
The word waiting doesn't do it justice. Waiting, in the ordinary human sense, is what you do at a bus stop, in a dentist's office, in a line at the grocery store. There is a known endpoint. There is a reasonable expectation that the waiting will resolve into something comprehensible. What the men on the Western Front did was different. They endured, hour after hour, day after day, with no endpoint visible, no resolution promised, no comprehensible logic to explain why this moment was survivable and the next one wouldn't be. A man could spend 3 weeks in a frontline trench without once going over the top, without once participating in an attack or a raid, and still come back changed in ways his family couldn't see and he couldn't name. The waiting itself was a weapon, and it worked. The trenches of the Western Front were not the straight, simple ditches that people picture when they imagine the war. They were cities. Entire cities built underground, stretching for hundreds of miles, with their own supply lines and communication routes and infrastructure. A full trench system consisted of 3 basic parallel trenches connected by perpendicular passageways. The front line was closest to the enemy, sometimes less than 70 yards away in certain sectors, closer than the length of a basketball court. Behind it was the support trench. Behind that, the reserve trench. And connecting them all, a labyrinth of communication trenches, running diagonally backward so that no single shell burst could wipe out an entire passageway. The trenches were not straight, but dug in a zigzag pattern, so that if an enemy soldier got into the trench, he could not fire straight down the line. Consider the engineering that implies, the planning, the labor, the sheer tonnage of dirt that was moved. And then consider the fact that after all that effort, after all those miles of dug earth and timber shoring and barbed wire, the line barely moved for years. The entire front shifted back and forth by miles, sometimes by yards, at a cost measured in hundreds of thousands of human lives per shift, the mechanism consuming enormous resources to produce almost nothing. Death was a constant companion to those serving in the line, even when no raid or attack was launched or defended against. In busy sectors, the constant shell fire directed by the enemy brought random death, whether the victims were lounging in a trench or lying in a dugout. It has been estimated that up to 1/3 of Allied casualties on the Western Front were sustained in the trenches themselves, not in attacks, not in offensives, but in the daily, grinding business of being there.
His name was Henri Balbus, and he was a French writer, 40 years old in 1914, far too old for this, who volunteered anyway because he believed in France, the way his generation had been taught to believe. He kept a journal. He described the inside of a frontline dugout as a cave that could barely hold 20 men, carved into the earth at the base of the frontline trench, with a ceiling so low you couldn't stand upright, with walls that sweated moisture and sometimes ran with water, with the smell of wet clay and unwashed men, and the particular sweetish rot smell of something nearby that nobody talked about directly. The floor was often ankle-deep in water after rain. The men slept in it, not because they wanted to, because the alternative was to stay up in the trench where the snipers worked. A German sniper, during quiet periods, could wait with absolute patience for a helmet to appear above the parapet and fire at it with a rifle so accurate, from a distance so precisely calculated, that the shot arrived before the sound did. Men learned not to raise their heads, learned to move crouched, to sleep bent, to live in a permanent physical crouch that after months began to feel natural. The daily routine in a frontline trench was its own particular kind of horror, because it was so structured, so repetitive, so almost normal in its rhythms. Stand to before dawn, breakfast from a mess tin, sometimes hot, usually not, depending on whether the supply runners had made it through the night. Work parties during daylight hours, repairing damaged sections of trench, moving supplies, digging new sections, all of it done in the crouch, all of it done with one ear always tilted toward the sound of incoming. Inspection of rifles, of ammunition, of equipment. Stand to again at dusk, Nighttime patrols into no man's land, the most feared duty of all, when small parties of men crawled out between the lines in the darkness to cut wire, to gather intelligence, to listen, and then back before dawn, if you made it back. And then the whole cycle again. Trench foot was a serious medical condition suffered by soldiers across the Western Front. Caused by prolonged exposure to damp, unsanitary conditions, it would gradually numb the feet and turn the skin red or blue. If untreated, trench foot could turn gangrenous, resulting in amputation. To prevent it, the men were told to change their socks frequently and to rub whale oil into their feet. They were issued 3 pairs of socks. They were expected to keep all 3 clean and dry in conditions where clean and dry were essentially theoretical concepts. Men who developed trench foot were often blamed, by officers who had never spent a night in the mud, for insufficient personal hygiene. The medical wards filled with men missing their feet. Rats in their millions infested the trenches. They gorged themselves on human remains and could grow to the size of a cat. Men, exasperated and afraid, would attempt to rid the trenches of them by various methods. Gunfire, with the bayonet, even by clubbing them to death. It was futile. Lice were a constant irritation, causing itching and spreading disease such as trench fever, which was debilitating and common. Dugouts frequently collapsed or flooded, and the air smelled of excrement, rot, and unwashed bodies. There is a reason why the men who came back from the Western Front so rarely spoke about what they'd seen. It wasn't stoicism. It wasn't toughness. The experience existed in a register for which peacetime English simply had no instruments. No words for what the trenches smelled like at 3 in the morning, when the rats were moving, and the distant guns were muttering, and the man next to you was whispering someone's name in his sleep. And yet, and this is the thing that keeps surfacing when you read the letters and the diaries and the accounts of the men who were actually there, the trenches also produced something extraordinary, something unexpected. A quality of human connection so intense, so stripped of all pretense, that men who survived would spend the rest of their lives struggling to find anything in peacetime that came close to it. Soldiers lived with one another in extremely close quarters, in often dangerous, dirty, and stressful conditions. Strong bonds of friendship and camaraderie formed. The trust they placed in each other was born of absolute necessity. Your mate was the man who warned you about the sniper, who dragged you back when you froze, who held your hand in the dark when the shelling went on so long that your mind started to give way. These bonds, forged in fear and exhaustion, were as strong and as vital as any the men had known in civilian life. They were the only thing that made the unendurable endurable for a while, because the unendurable was about to get significantly worse. What happened at Verdun, beginning in February of 1916, was not, in any sense that a rational person could define, a battle. It was an experiment. A German general named Erich von Falkenhayn had proposed something that, even for this war, was genuinely new in its cold-bloodedness. He had looked at the strategic situation and concluded that breaking through the French lines was not, perhaps, the point. The point was to destroy the French army as a fighting force, not defeat it, destroy it. His plan was to attack a position so symbolically important to France that the French would throw every man they had into its defense, and then to use German firepower to kill them there, systematically, faster than they could be replaced. He called this, in a memorandum that historians would later argue about for decades, bleeding France white. The city of Verdun had been a fortress since Roman times. It had withstood sieges. It sat on a bend in the Meuse River, surrounded by a ring of concrete forts, built after the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. To abandon Verdun would be to admit something unthinkable about France, about French history, about the whole meaning of why this war was being fought. And Falkenhayn knew this. He was counting on it. His plan was to use France's own pride as the mechanism of her destruction. The bombardment that opened the Battle of Verdun on February 21, 1916, involved over 1,200 guns firing on a front of roughly 8 miles. The noise was heard in towns over 100 miles away. People in villages far from the front came out of their houses, looked at the sky, couldn't understand what they were hearing. It sounded like a permanent, rolling thunder that didn't belong to any weather pattern they'd ever seen. Birds abandoned their nesting grounds across an entire region. Horses panicked in their stables 20 miles from the line.
For the men actually inside that bombardment, the French soldiers in their bunkers and their trenches in the hills above Verdun, there are almost no words. One survivor described it as the world ending, except that it kept not ending, kept not ending, kept not ending. Each second, another second of impossible noise and concussion and flying earth. And after a few hours, the question stopped being whether you would die and became simply when. And after a few hours more, the question stopped mattering because a mind can only hold so much, and then it goes somewhere else, somewhere quiet and interior, somewhere the shells can't reach, and you either come back from that place or you don't. The Battle of Verdun lasted 302 days. Not weeks, days. It ran from February to December of 1916, grinding and churning through spring and summer and fall and into winter, consuming men at a rate that eventually totaled around 700,000 casualties between the two armies combined. The ground around Verdun was so saturated with metal, shell casings, barbed wire, unexploded ordnance, shrapnel fragments, that it became officially uninhabitable after the war. Some of it remains so today. There are villages in that region that were never rebuilt. They exist on French maps as legal entities with no living population, ghost towns with mayors who oversee nothing but earth and memory. Now here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The Battle of Verdun and the simultaneous catastrophe at the Somme were not separate tragedies. They were two parts of the same machine. The Somme offensive had been planned as a joint Franco-British operation, its launch date coordinated to relieve the pressure on Verdun, where, since late February, the French army had already been bleeding for months. By the time British forces attacked on the Somme in July, France had been holding Verdun for nearly 5 months at catastrophic cost. The British would attack to the north, drawing German resources away, creating breathing room, maybe, achieving the breakthrough that everyone had been promising since 1914. What happened on the morning of July 1st, 1916, at the Somme, is one of the most precisely documented disasters in military history. The British had spent 7 days bombarding the German lines, 7 days of constant artillery fire, designed to destroy the German wire, collapse the German dugouts, silence the German guns, so that when the British infantry went over the top on the morning of the 1st, they would walk across no man's land into a position already neutralized and broken. That was the plan. The planners believed it so completely that the infantry was ordered in some sectors to walk, not run, across the open ground, so as not to break the formation. What they didn't fully account for was how deep the German dugouts actually went. Some of them were 30, 40 feet underground, deep enough to survive even that week of bombardment. When the British guns finally stopped, when the silence came, that sudden, terrible silence after 7 days of continuous noise, the German soldiers climbed up from their bunkers, dragged their machine guns into position, and waited. When a British officer blew his whistle and the men climbed out of their trenches and started walking forward across the churned mud of no man's land, they walked into something that language was not built to carry. On July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered its worst single-day loss in its entire history. Around 60,000 total casualties, roughly 20,000 dead, nearly 40,000 wounded or missing, in a single day. More British soldiers killed on that one morning than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. And then July 2nd came, and then July 3rd. The offensive didn't stop. It ran until November, nearly 5 months of this. The total British casualties at the Somme reached 420,000. The Germans lost roughly 500,000. The Allies advanced about 7 miles. 7 miles. There was a boy from a small town in County Down, Ireland, whose letter home was intercepted by the censor and survived in an archive somewhere in Belfast. He wrote it 3 days before July 1st. He doesn't describe the plan. He doesn't talk about strategy. He describes the sound the larks make over no man's land in the early morning before the shelling begins, and how it seems impossible that anything beautiful can exist in a place like this, and how he has started to believe that the larks don't actually know where they are, that they're just singing because they're larks, because that's what larks do, and that there is something in that which helps him. He didn't make it past July 1st. He was 19. The killing at Verdun and the Somme was enormous, industrial, visible from a distance, measurable in statistics, graspable, barely, by the mind at scale. What came next was different. What came next was intimate. What came next was personal in the most violating, most private way imaginable. Because there is a particular species of terror that works not by destroying a body all at once, but by transforming it, slowly, invisibly, without warning, without sound, without the merciful swiftness of a bullet. The first use of poison gas in battle happened on April 22, 1915, when German forces released chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders along a 4-mile section of the front near the Belgian town of Ypres. It was the first time in history that chemical weapons had been deployed on a battlefield. Not a preliminary attack, not a smaller precedent, the first time ever. The gas rolled forward in a yellowish-green cloud, carried by the wind, drifting low over the ground because it was heavier than air. The French and Algerian soldiers in the Allied trenches saw the cloud coming and had no reference point for it. Some thought it was a smokescreen, some thought it was fog. Nobody ran, because nobody understood what they were looking at until it reached them. Chlorine gas attacks the lungs. It reacts with the moisture in the tissue and produces hydrochloric acid inside your airways, inside the delicate, wet walls of the alveoli, inside the passages that connect your throat to the place where your blood picks up oxygen. The sensation it produces has been described by survivors as drowning without water. Your body registers the damage before your mind has processed what's happening. The coughing begins, then the constriction, then the burning, deep in the chest, spreading up into the throat, into the mouth. The eyes tear involuntarily, vision blurs, and the body, responding to the trauma, begins flooding the lungs with fluid, the same response it would have to infection, to severe pneumonia, which means that in the final stages, a man killed by chlorine gas is technically drowning. His own immune system is filling his lungs with the fluid that will kill him. The men who survived the first gas attack at Ypres described watching their comrades die and being unable to help, because the gas was still present in the air, and to approach a downed man was to go down yourself. They described men clutching their throats, men whose lips had turned blue from lack of oxygen, men who had torn their own collars open trying to breathe, and over all of it, that smell. Something like bleach, something like a swimming pool, something chemical and wrong that the human nose recognized as a threat before the brain had processed the information. The Allied command moved quickly to develop countermeasures. Within weeks, soldiers were being issued gas masks of various descriptions. At first, in those early days, simply cloth pads soaked in urine, because the chemistry of urine could partially neutralize chlorine. The cutting edge of military medicine in 1915 was urinate on your cloth and hold it over your face. Within months, proper respirators were being issued, rubber and glass contraptions that fit over the entire face, that reduced vision and made breathing labored, but could block the gas. And then the Germans introduced phosgene. And then, most feared of all, mustard gas. Mustard gas was different. Not immediately deadly, not a quick, overwhelming assault on the lungs. Mustard gas was a weapon designed to wound, to incapacitate, to consume medical resources and break morale over days and weeks rather than minutes. It attacked the skin, it attacked the eyes. It was oily, heavier than air, and it could persist in low-lying ground for days after an attack, lurking in shell craters and ditches, invisible, nearly odorless, waiting for a man to step into it. A soldier exposed to mustard gas wouldn't feel the full effects for hours. He might walk through a contaminated area and feel almost nothing, then go to sleep and wake in the night with his eyes sealed shut, with massive blisters forming under his clothes,
with a burning sensation covering every inch of skin the liquid had contacted. Men exposed to sufficient concentrations were temporarily or permanently blinded. There was a young Austrian-born corporal serving in a German unit as a message runner in October of 1918, very near the end of the war. He had survived 4 years of fighting with almost nothing but minor wounds and extraordinary luck.
He was treated for mustard gas injuries at a military hospital, temporarily blinded, lying in a ward for weeks, trying to understand what had happened to him, what would happen to him next. While he lay there, the news came that Germany had surrendered. He wept, not with relief, with rage, with humiliation. Something in him, in those weeks of blindness and defeat, crystallized into a fury that would take 20 years to fully develop, and another 40 million lives to fully spend. His name was Adolf Hitler, and the second part of that story belongs to another time, because the first part isn't finished. Something else was happening alongside all of this, something that the military command on both sides was desperately trying to suppress, trying to deny, trying to explain away with courts-martial and the cold official language of discipline. The men in the trenches were changing, not just physically, not just psychologically, something deeper, something that touches the oldest questions about what a human being owes to the systems that claim authority over his life. Shell shock was being reported in numbers that couldn't be ignored. By 1916, tens of thousands of men had been evacuated from the front, with symptoms that the medical establishment could neither fully explain nor effectively treat. Tremors, paralysis, mutism, the total loss of speech in men whose bodies were physically uninjured, blindness with no organic cause, men who had simply, at some point, stopped being able to move forward. The official response, in many cases, was prosecution. Soldiers suffering from what we now understand to be severe psychological trauma faced courts-martial. A significant number were executed by their own armies, by officers who had themselves never spent a night in a frontline trench. And somewhere in the chain of command between the men who made the decisions and the men who lived in the mud, there was a gap so vast, so profound, so morally catastrophic, that it would take generations of historians to fully describe it. The machinery was still running, the generals were still planning offensives, the politicians were still talking about victory, and the men, the ones still breathing, still holding rifles, still present in the mud, had started to look at the gap between what they had been promised and what was happening to them, and to ask a question that no commanding officer had an answer for. Not, what is happening? They knew what was happening. The question was, how much more? Spring came to the Western Front the way it always did, indifferent, almost insulting in its beauty. The mud dried slightly at the edges, the shell craters filled with rainwater that caught the light. Somewhere in the blasted landscape between the lines, the larks came back, because larks do not read casualty reports and do not attend briefings about the next offensive. And in the French trenches along the Chemin des Dames Ridge in April of 1917, a man climbed down from the fire step after stand 2, looked at the men around him, and said something that no soldier in a modern army was supposed to say, something so simple and so devastating that the officers who heard it repeated later didn't quite know how to write it down in official language. He said, "I won't go. Not I can't. Not I'm afraid. Not I'm sick, give me a medical chit, find me a reason that fits inside the system." He said, "I won't." The distinction between those two words is the entire story of what happened next. Because I can't is a personal failure, something the military machine knows how to process, a coward, a weakling, a man who needs to be made an example of. But I won't is different. I won't is a judgment. I won't means I have looked at what you are asking me to do, and I have weighed it against everything I understand about survival and reason and the value of human life, and I have found your request to be something I am no longer willing to comply with. I won't is a philosophical position, and philosophical positions in armies numbering in the millions are not manageable by firing squad. What happened in the French army in the spring and early summer of 1917 is known, in the dry language of military history, as the French army mutinies. Mutiny is the wrong word.
It carries connotations of violence, of insurrection, of men turning their weapons on their officers and seizing control of ships or fortresses. This was something stranger and, in a way, more frightening to the high command than outright rebellion.
Beginning in late April of 1917, in the aftermath of the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive, a promised breakthrough that had been sold to the troops as the decisive blow and that had instead produced 100,000 French casualties in 10 days for essentially no territorial gain, the French infantry began to refuse orders. Not all of them, not all at once, but in unit after unit, regiment after regiment, men told their officers in various ways and with varying degrees of formality that they would hold the trenches, but they would not attack. They would defend France. They would not be thrown against German machine guns in offensives that everyone from the private to the colonel could see were designed not to win the war, but simply to use up French bodies. By the time the refusals had spread to their peak in June of 1917, nearly half the divisions of the French army on the Western Front had been affected. Nearly half. Not a handful of troublemakers. A movement, spreading through an army of millions, passed from one trench to the next through whispered conversations and shared cigarettes, and the slow, collective recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The men were not going home. They were not surrendering. They were making a distinction, drawing a line in their own minds and in their collective behavior between what they would do and what they would not do. We will hold. We will not advance. The French soldiers moved in groups across the countryside, traveling from camp to camp, singing the Internationale and waving red flags in some cases, demanding better food, more leave, medical attention, an end to the kind of pointless offensives that had accomplished nothing but the filling of cemeteries. The movement had no single leader, which made it almost impossible to suppress through the usual methods. The new French commander, Philippe Pétain, brought in to replace the discredited Nivelle, understood this in a way that his predecessor had not. He went to the trenches himself. He talked to the men. He made promises about better conditions, more regular leave, an end to the most obviously suicidal attacks. And he quietly oversaw a process of courts-martial that resulted in the execution of somewhere between 40 and 68 men. The exact number has been disputed by historians for decades, the records sealed for years, and the sentencing of hundreds more to prison or hard labor in French colonial territories. The executions were not announced. The entire episode was classified at the highest level and kept secret from the German intelligence services, from the press, from the public. The French government did not officially acknowledge the mutinies until 1967, 50 years. 2 full generations. The men who had said, "I won't," were dead by then, most of them. The ones who survived the war itself, the ones who came home and tried to return to normal life, the ones who had watched companions executed and carried that knowledge forward into peacetime like a stone in the chest. They never spoke publicly. The official history of the war made no mention of it. French school children were taught about the heroism at Verdun and the sacrifice at the Somme, and learned nothing about the spring of 1917, about nearly half an army that had looked at the battlefield and said, "No further." Across the Channel, the British Army was grappling with its own version of this reckoning. Around 306 British soldiers were executed for cowardice or desertion across the entire course of the war. Men shot by their own side, not because they had aided the enemy, but because their minds had broken under a weight that no mind was designed to carry. These were separate cases from the French mutinies, spread across 4 years of war rather than concentrated in a single spring, but they pointed to the same unbearable truth. The system demanded more than human beings could give, and when human beings broke, the system's answer was often to destroy them for breaking. The war did not get its name until it was over. The phrase First World War implies the existence of a second, and nobody living through 1914 had any desire to contemplate that possibility. The name came later, gradually, as the shape of what had happened became clearer,
as historians and journalists began to reach for language adequate to the catastrophe. What made it first? Not simply the number of dead, staggering as those numbers were, not simply the geographic scale, though the fighting extended across Europe, into the Middle East, into Africa, into the Pacific, pulling in soldiers from India and Australia and Canada and New Zealand and the United States.
What made it first was something more fundamental, something about what it demonstrated.
It was the first war to be fully industrialized, the first war in which the productive capacity of modern nation-states, their factories, their railroads, their chemical plants, their engineering establishments, was turned entirely toward the purpose of killing, and turned that way for 4 years without pause. Previous wars had been terrible. Previous wars had produced casualties that shocked the people of their time, but no previous war had shown, with such absolute and undeniable clarity, what happens when the Industrial Revolution is applied to violence. When you can produce shells faster than men can dig holes to hide from them. When chemistry, the same chemistry that had revolutionized agriculture and medicine, is turned toward weapons designed to destroy human tissue in new and previously unimagined ways. The First World War was not first in horror, it was first in mechanism.
The complete mobilization of an entire society, its economy, its science, its culture, its psychology, toward a single military objective.
That mechanism, once demonstrated, could not be undemonstrated. It went into the archive of human possibility. It sat there, in 1918, waiting. The cruel irony that should chill you, the one that history keeps trying to get you to feel in your bones rather than just register with your intellect, is this. The war that the men in the trenches believed would be the last one. The war so terrible that the civilized world would look at it and recoil from the very idea of war forever. That war became the template. Not the deterrent, the template. The methods developed on the Western Front, the artillery techniques, the coordination of infantry and armor and air power, the use of chemical agents, the industrial production of weapons at unprecedented scale, all of it moved forward into the next conflict.
The lesson that military planners took from the Western Front was not that this must never happen again. The lesson was how to do it more efficiently next time.
The men who refused to go over the top in the spring of 1917 understood something that the generals and the politicians could not afford to acknowledge. They understood that the machinery had stopped serving any purpose that a rational human being could identify and endorse. The territory gained, measured against the lives spent, made no sense that could be explained to the man asked to spend his life. Their refusal, muted, suppressed, erased from the official record for half a century, was the most coherent moral response that the situation allowed. Not heroic in the conventional sense, not dramatic, not recorded in monuments. A quiet, stubborn, deeply human insistence that there is a line, and we have found it, and it is here. The generals called it a crisis of morale.
The censors called it information that could not be allowed to reach the enemy, or the public, or other armies who might be inspired by the example. For 50 years, history called it nothing at all, because the records were sealed, and the survivors were silent, and the official version had no room for it. But if you go back and read the letters, the diaries, the court-martial transcripts that began to be declassified in the decades after the Second World War, if you sit with what those men actually wrote, in the moments when they thought nobody who mattered would ever read it, you find something that fits neither the narrative of heroic sacrifice nor tragic waste. You find lucidity. Men who understood exactly what was happening to them and why, who had run out of illusions about what the war was for, and who were making, in their limited and dangerous way, the most human of choices, not to die for nothing. The guns stopped on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918.
The precision of it is almost liturgical, and it was, in a way. The armistice was designed to be memorable, designed to mark time, designed to give the world something to point to and say, here is where it ended. Here is the line between before and after. What it could not do was heal what had been done. The men who came home from the Western Front came home into a world with no vocabulary for what they carried. The language of trauma, of post-traumatic stress,
of the long-term psychological consequences of sustained exposure to violence and horror. None of it existed in 1918 in any useful clinical form. Shell shock was still a contested diagnosis, still associated in many medical and military minds with weakness, with something constitutional rather than something inflicted. The men who shook, who couldn't sleep, who flinched at cars backfiring and turned toward walls in crowds and drank themselves into silence in the years after the war, they were largely on their own. A woman in Birmingham, England, wrote in her diary in 1923 that her husband, who had come back from France in 1918, apparently physically whole, had not spoken more than 20 consecutive sentences to her in 5 years of marriage. She writes that she sometimes sits across the dinner table from him and tries to imagine what she is looking at, not who he is now, but who he was when she married him in 1913, before everything. She writes that she is not sure anymore which version was more real, and she writes, without bitterness, with a kind of exhausted clarity, "I think what they brought back from France was the knowledge of something, and I think the knowledge is the thing that won't let them come back the rest of the way." The knowledge of something. She doesn't specify what. She doesn't need to. The war left its marks on the landscape in ways that will outlast everyone alive today. The Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, is a region of northeastern France declared uninhabitable after the war and never fully returned to ordinary use. It covers hundreds of square miles of former battlefield. The soil is saturated with unexploded shells. Estimates suggest that around 1 billion shells were fired on the Western Front during the 4 years of the war, and that roughly 1 in 3 of them failed to detonate. They are still there. Every year, Belgian and French bomb disposal teams recover thousands of tons of unexploded ordnance from fields and construction sites. Every year, there are accidents. Farmers and construction workers are killed by shells that have been in the earth for over 100 years, patiently waiting. The war is not over in the soil of France and Belgium. It is waiting to be disturbed. The men who refused to go forward in the spring of 1917, the ones who drew a line in the mud of the Chemin des Dames and said, "Here, this far and no further," they didn't know any of that. They couldn't see the shape of what was coming. They were just men, tired and clear-eyed in the way that people become when every illusion has been stripped away, who made a decision about what they would and would not do with the lives they still had. History erased them. The official record had no room for what they represented. Their names, mostly, are not on monuments. Their stories were not told to their grandchildren. What they knew, they took with them. But the ground remembers. Go to the Chemin des Dames today and stand on the ridge and look out over the valley of the Aisne. The countryside is beautiful in the way that French countryside is always beautiful. The soft hills, the stone villages, the vineyards catching the afternoon light. It looks healed. It looks finished. But underground, in the chalk beneath your feet, there are still tunnels, still the remnants of the trench systems, still, occasionally, the bones of men who were lost and never recovered, who were listed as missing and are still, technically, missing, somewhere in the earth beneath the ordinary French afternoon, present but invisible, gone but not gone. There is a question the First World War keeps asking, and that every generation since has tried to answer in its own way, and that has never quite been resolved. It is not the question of who started it, or who could have stopped it, or what the world would look like if Franz Ferdinand's driver had taken a different turn on a June morning in Sarajevo. Those are interesting questions, but they are not the question. The question is this: what do you do when the system demands something that the human beings caught inside it can see, clearly and with complete lucidity, is wrong? The men in the trenches tried several answers. They endured. They bonded. They hoped. They prayed. They wrote letters home that the censors marked up before their families ever saw them. Some of them broke. Some of them refused. Some of them were shot for refusing. Some of them survived the war and came home and never spoke about it, and died decades later with the knowledge intact and unshared, carried to their graves like a private weight. None of their answers were adequate to the scale of the question. How could they be? It is still too large. It is still being asked. In different languages, in different uniforms,
in different landscapes, with different weapons, and different justifications, and different official histories that will take their own decades to declassify and their own generations of researchers to excavate. And somewhere, in every iteration, there is still a man on the fire step at dawn, looking out over ground he didn't choose, toward an enemy he doesn't personally hate, holding a weapon he didn't design, waiting for an order from someone he'll never meet, thinking about a sound he heard yesterday that he can't get out of his head. Not the artillery, not the gas alarm, something smaller, something human. A lark, maybe, singing above no man's land in the early light, indifferent to everything below it, singing because that's what it does, because that's what it has always done, because no war has yet figured out how to make it stop.